We're thinking this week about this theme of being renewed. And in these first three evenings, we're looking at Isaiah 6, the first kind of 7 verses of that to help us think about that theme. Thank you, Stuart, very much indeed. And as we do that, I want to read the first 7 verses for us. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongues from the altar. With it he touched my mouth, and he said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. There was once a man who wandered into his vet's practice carrying a hamster. The hamster was not breathing, it was unresponsive, and he showed it to the vet, and the vet said, Yep, it's dead. And the man said, No, it can't be, my precious hamster, it can't be dead. I demand a second opinion. So the vet said, Okay. Brings in a Labrador. The Labrador comes up to the hamster, it kind of sniffs it and nudges it with its nose, looks at the vet and shakes its head. It's dead. The man says, No, it can't be. There's got to be someone else. There's got to be someone else we can ask. I need another opinion. So the vet gets in a cat. And the cat kind of jumps in and jumps on the table and kind of slaps the hamster around a bit, and nothing happens. And the cat looks up at the vet, shakes his head, says, It's dead. The man says, Okay. The vet says, Well, that'll be £1,000, please. And I said, £1,000 to tell me my hamster's dead? And the vet says, Well, my fee is only £200, but then there's the lab test and the CAT scan. Sorry. Feel free to groan. Just don't boo. My kids will tell you that I love to tell dad jokes. Sometimes he laughs. Okay. I had my own diagnosis recently. I was diagnosed as being colourblind. Just came right out of the purple. I'll stop. Diagnosis. Here's a serious diagnostic question for you this evening. What's wrong with the world? If you had to answer that question, what at the most basic and most fundamental level is wrong with our world? Because how you answer that question helps you think about what's the solution. They're related questions, aren't they? They're 2 of the most important questions we can ask. What's wrong? What's the solution? And people in our world will have different answers to those questions, won't they? Some people, if we ask what's wrong, they'll say, well, we need to become more tolerant, more understanding of one another. The solution is really better education. For some of us, we'll say, no, the problem is really it's greed, and the solution must therefore be sort of economic or financial. Some of us will say, actually, that justice, inequalities, they're the problem, and so the solution might be political. And others might look at the world and say, our biggest problem is environmental, so the solution must be ecological. What is the biggest problem? And of course, if you're an atheist, if you're a consistent atheist, you should look at the world and say, there's no problem. It just is. There's no kind of ultimate right or wrong to any of it. It just is what it is. You might not like it, but you can't say that it's ultimately wrong. See, the Bible gives us a slightly different answer to the question, doesn't it, of what's wrong. But if we're to understand our theme of grace, if we're to be renewed in grace, we do really need to first understand what it's for. What's the problem it is addressing? And so this evening for you, I've only got just two headings for you tonight. And the first one is we look at Isaiah 6, and we looked at verses 1 to 4 last night, we're looking at 5 to 7 tonight. The first heading is this: we've got to see the human plight. Before we can see the divine solution, we need to see the human plight. And here's Isaiah's reaction to his vision. You remember last night, if you were here, Isaiah has this astonishing, heart-stopping, breathtaking, captivating vision of the exalted, majestic, awesome and holy God. And having seen that, how does he respond? Have a look down at verse 5. What does he say? Having seen this vision, he says, "Woe to me! Woe to me! I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Here's the kind of the uncomfortable and unwelcome truth for our world and our society. Human beings are not basically good, with a few minor flaws. The Bible from start to finish says actually human beings are basically bad. We are basically sinners in desperate need of grace. Theologians call this the idea of total depravity. Now, total depravity does not mean you're as bad as you possibly could be. But it does mean sin kind of works its way through all things. It doesn't run around some things. It runs through everything. It touches every fibre of our very being. It's what Paul described in Romans chapter 3 when he said this: "There's no one righteous, not even one. There's no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one." That's the hard truth which we have to face up to. Confronted with a vision of the holiness, the majesty, the awesomeness and the glory of God. Woe to me. Woe to me. I'm a man of unclean lips before this almighty and awesome King. That's our human plight. Sometimes when we're running courses exploring Christianity, we use a little kind of diagram that hopefully you can see on a screen. And it's very simple. All we do is we do a little scale. And the scale kind of runs from 0 to 100. And 100 at the top, that's moral perfection. That's where God lives. And 0 at the bottom is kind of, that's pure evil. And then we ask people, we say, okay, let's think about this. Who is the greatest person? Who's the best person who's lived in the last 100 years? And who do you think people say? Well, it's people like Mother Teresa or Nelson Mandela, and we'll say, well, so where would you rate them? And they're pretty high. I mean, they're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. They'll have had their bad days where they kick the cat, but we stick them somewhere up there. And then we say, now, who's the worst person that has lived in the last 100 years? The answer is always the same. What is it? Hitler. It's Hitler. We say, where do we put Hitler? Well, maybe he sent his mother a birthday card, so we won't put him right at the bottom, but he's down there, isn't he? And then we say, and what about you? How would you rank yourself? How are you going on this scale? Where do you think you live? And where does everybody put themselves? Right in the middle. Right in the middle. But there's still this gap, right? There's still this gap to the moral perfection of God. We say, what are you going to do about that gap? It's still there. You can never bridge it. You can never reach the standard. So what do you do with that gap? A few years ago, there was a series, it's still running on Netflix, called The Good Place. And The Good Place was a series about heaven and hell. And it's what happens to people when they die. And it charts the story of this lady who she ends up in the good place, but it's really by accident. The whole premise of the good place is your deeds are weighed when you die. And if your good deeds are enough, if they weigh enough in balance of your bad, then you get into the good place. Everyone else goes to the bad place. Only about 1 in 1,000 people on this scheme make it to the good place. Everyone else goes to the bad place. And this woman sort of finds herself accidentally there, struggling to make sense. And she talks to the sort of the guardian of this place. And she's outraged that this exists. She says, no, look, there should be a medium place for medium people. Who, they're not as good as they might have been, but they're not bad either. I think that's how our world thinks, isn't it? If you ask your people around you, your family, your friends, your neighbours, your colleagues, they'll say, look, I know I'm not perfect, and I'm not Mother Teresa, but I'm not Hitler. Surely there's a medium place. They can't see the gap. They don't get it. A number of years ago, there was a film that my kids enjoyed watching. I don't know if any of you have seen this film. It's called Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. Anyone seen this? Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. It's a very random film. It's for kids. The premise is ridiculous, but it's basically this madcap inventor who invents a machine that can make the weather sort of rain down whatever food stuff you program into it. It's bizarre, it's ridiculous, it all gets out of control and needs fixing. But one of the little side plots in the movie is he's got this pet monkey. And because he's a madcap inventor, he's invented for his pet monkey a thought translator. So that this monkey that accompanies him everywhere wears this little kind of headband, has a baby monitor strapped to his chest, and everything the monkey thinks comes out of the baby monitor. And you hear these comedy moments where the monkey comes out with all sorts of inappropriate things. Now imagine I could invent one of those. And imagine I could strap it to you just for a day. So that everything you thought came out. Anyone want to change their answer? See, the gap is real, isn't it? The gap is serious. Woe is me is Isaiah's vision. When you rightly see who God is and you rightly see who you are, you see the need for grace. You see the human plight. You see the problem. What does sin look like in our culture? Well, how about this Burger King advert that said this? You have the right to have what you want, exactly when you want it. Because on the menu of life, you are today's special. And tomorrow's. And the day after that. And, well, you get the picture. Yes, that's right. We may be the king. But you, my friends, are the almighty ruler. That's how our culture thinks about what human beings are. We think we are our own gods. Somebody once said the essence of sin, if you want a little way to remember sin, S-I-N, it's shove off God. I'm in charge. No to your rules. Or it's what somebody else said, it's Sinatra syndrome, isn't it? I did it my way. That's our gap. And when we see who God really is, we say, woe to me. I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips. And we've seen the Lord God Almighty. We need to know this, don't we? Before we can get to grace, before we can get to the solution, we really need to feel the weight of the human plight. We need to feel the weight of this gap. We need to have that sense of what Isaiah knew. Woe. Woe to me. Woe to me. We need this in our evangelism, don't we? We live in a culture of self-esteem. You be you, you're perfect as you are. We applaud and affirm everyone for all of their life choices. Everyone thinks they should go to the medium place, and we need to say no. It's bad news before you get the good news. Spurgeon once said, whenever people speak ill of you, then just kind of hold on to the thought that you're really far worse than they even know. That's true, isn't it? Whenever someone says bad about you, you say, yeah, that's right, and it's far worse. That's who we are. Woe to me. Woe to me. I'm a man of unclean lips. Thomas Boston wrote this quote in his book, The Human Nature, its fourfold state. He said this describing man. He says, Here was a stately building, man carved like a fair palace, but now lying in ashes. Let us stand and look on the ruins and drop a tear. That's who we really are. We need to feel this weight of who we are before the pure majesty, the moral purity of God himself. When we get to the human plight, then we see what grace is for. Then we see why we so desperately need it, and then we see why it's so amazing. In some ways, the blacker the bad news, the starker the contrast of kind of the light of grace, isn't it? The more we see our sin, the more grace astounds us and floors us. So that's our second heading. Our second heading, we've talked about the human plight, but then there's the divine solution. And we get a little glimpse of it here in this passage, don't we? Have a look down. Have a look at verse 6. Here's God's solution for this problem. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongues from the altar. And with it he touched my mouth and said, "See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." Do you pick up where the imagery is coming from? Remember, this vision is happening. He's seeing God in the temple. It's the temple area, and there's the altar. What happens at the altar? What happens in the temple? It's the place of sacrifice. There's this imagery of sacrifice that's happening as something comes from the altar. The place of sacrifice, and what it brings is the guilt is taken away. And atonement is made. You know, throughout the Old Testament, they were sacrificing all the time. The priests never kind of stood still and sat down. They were constantly sacrificing. But as the New Testament reminds us, really the blood of bulls and goats could never really take away sin. It could never really deal with the problem. It was a picture of how serious sin was. Life needed to be paid for with life, blood for blood. And all of it leads, as we've already heard, it all leads to Jesus. It all points us to him, the Lamb who was slain on the altar of the cross, so that your guilt is really taken away, so that your sin is completely atoned for. Notice these things about this. Do you notice that grace is God's initiative? It doesn't begin with Isaiah, does it? He doesn't try and work his way out of it. He knows he can't. He knows his plight. No, the grace is the full initiative of God. He moves first. One of the seraphim flew. Do you notice it's instantaneous? As soon as it happens, as soon as that live coal, as soon as that thing happens from the altar, it just touches him, instantaneously it's done. The declaration is made, guilt taken away, sin atoned for. Do you notice it's comprehensive? There's nothing left undone. There's nothing incomplete. There's nothing for Isaiah to kind of fill up or make whole. It's all done. Guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for. God has done everything required. As we sometimes sing, Jesus paid it all. It's all to him I owe. Some of you may have seen the musical production. I don't know. Has anyone seen Hamilton? Anyone had the privilege of seeing Hamilton? It's an amazing production. I'd recommend it. It's not easy work to watch, but it is an astonishing piece of musical theatre. It charts the story of Alexander Hamilton. He's one of the founding fathers in America, and his rise and the ups and the downs. And there's a moment near the end where Alexander Hamilton's really made a mess of things. His son Philip has died in a duel that Alexander really encouraged him into. And he bears that responsibility. And he's also been caught having an affair with somebody else. And his wife has found out, and they move upstate for the summer. And there's this musical piece which rolls around talking about what it's like for them as they're going through the unimaginable. The grief of loss, the breakdown in relationship. They are walking through the unimaginable. And the little bridge in there has these kind of lines, forgiveness. Can you imagine? Forgiveness. Can you imagine? And as the song comes to an end, the actors, they turn their backs from the audience. The music comes towards its end. The lights go down. And just before it does, his wife reaches out her hand and she takes his. It's this beautiful moment of grace, of healing, of reconciliation, of forgiveness. It's entirely initiated by her. That's exactly what God does for us. He Before we even try to reach for him, he reaches his hand for us in grace and healing, reconciliation, restoration, and forgiveness. Some of you may have heard of a man called Henry Garreck. Henry Garreck was a Lutheran pastor he was from Germany, but he was working in America. And around the end of the Second World War, Henry Garreck was given an unenviable job. He was sent to be the chaplain at Nuremberg to the German war criminals. That was his charge. He really didn't want to do it, but he thought, well, if I don't, who else will go to these monsters? And so he undertook this work. When he arrived at Nuremberg, he visited all of these men like Rudolf Hess, Goering, von Ribbentrop. He visited them all individually to meet them. He invited them to come along to the little chapel services and if they wanted to talk with him. Hess refused. Goering accepted, as did von Ribbentrop. And 13 of the 15 actually attended these little services where he would just explain the gospel to these men. He'd talk, he'd visit, and after almost a year, just before the trials were about to begin, he returned home. And as he returned home, the prisoners wrote to his wife. And they wrote to his wife and they said this: "Our dear chaplain Garreck is necessary for us, not only as a pastor, but also as the thoroughly good man he is. In this stage of the trial, it's impossible for any other man than him to break through the walls that have been built up around us. In a spiritual sense, even stronger than a material one. Therefore, could you please leave him with us? We'll be deeply indebted to you." And he did. He stayed. He returned. He stayed with them through the trial. And on October the 1st, 1946, the verdicts were announced. Goering, von Ribbentrop, 4 others were all sentenced to death by hanging. On the eve of the executions, Garreck, he visited these men. He visited Goering. And Goering had hardened himself, and he said to the chaplain, he said to Garreck, he said, "Look, I'm not interested. I'm going to take my chances my own way." In fact, he committed suicide in his cell by cyanide that night. But Ribbentrop was different. He'd been listening. He'd been thinking. He'd been processing. He'd been talking. And von Ribbentrop was the first to be taken down to the gallows in the very early hours of the following morning. And as von Ribbentrop was tied up, an American officer asked him if he had any final words. And he looked at Garreck and he said, "I place all my confidence in the Lamb who made atonement for my sins. May God have mercy on my soul." And then looking straight at Garreck, he said, "And I'll see you again." I don't know how that story strikes you. Let me suggest to you, if you're offended by that story, you haven't really understood grace. If you think that men that evil just could not or should not find grace, you haven't understood the seriousness of your own sin. And you haven't understood grace because you still think it's basically for good people who can just add a bit on top. Now, grace is for thoroughly wicked and evil people. There's really nothing we can do. As Isaiah 64:6 says, all of our righteous deeds, they're like filthy rags. We are really no better than these men as we stand before the infinite majesty of the pure and holy God. And they found grace. One of them found grace. Amazing grace that reaches the most hardened of sinners. I don't know about you, I need to keep living in grace. I need to keep teaching myself about grace because I don't know if this reflects you, but I believe in my head that I'm justified by grace alone through faith alone. I believe that in my head. I know I'm justified by grace, but I live as if I'm justified by works. Now, I live as if really it is about how I'm doing. Almost each day I find myself going, well, how am I doing today? What's the scales like? Well, I've preached at a conference today, so I must be pretty good. But then, I've thought that and I've said that and I've done that. And I keep falling into this pattern of thinking I need to constantly, daily remind myself of the amazing free grace of God that pays in full for all my sin, past, present, and future. I need to stop relying on myself all the time and rely wholly on him. It completely transforms our lives, doesn't it, when we do? It liberates our service, because our service is now not an act of trying to earn favour. I don't serve him to get in his good books or to get the brownie points for heaven. I serve him because of all that he's done in serving me. It liberates me in my evangelism, because I know it's not on me, but the way my friends and family respond to the message, that's not about how well I do it. It's not about how persuasive I am or how persistent I am. It's all of grace. He takes the initiative. He enables people to be born again. He sends his Spirit to regenerate. My job is just to tell them it's all of him. As the Apostle Paul said, look, I sowed it and Apollos watered it, but God made it grow. Liberates us in our witness to speak freely, trusting him for his powerful grace. It liberates us in our prayer, doesn't it? It makes us persistent in prayer, because he is the one who can do miracles. He's the one who can do more than we ask or imagine. There's a man called Luke Short who lived in Virginia. He was a colonist who one day in his 103rd year remembered a sermon he had heard 85 years earlier, preached by a Puritan pastor called John Flavel. And the memory of that sermon as a 17-year-old, it so stirred his memory that there and then he repented of his sins and became a Christian. On his tombstone when he died, it's written, "Here lies a babe in grace, aged 3 years, who died according to nature, aged 106 years." God can save 103-year-olds. You can save your friend. Who's the person in your head that you think God can't reach them? Who's that person? Think of them now. Who's that person? God will never reach them. They're so hard and they're so far. They make it so difficult. God will never reach them. Who is that person? You just pray from now. Pray from you sat there right now that God can powerfully transform through his grace anybody he so chooses. What's wrong with our world? What's the solution? What's wrong? Well, G.K. Chesterton answered this well. There was once a question put in the Times newspaper. The question was, what's wrong with the world? G.K. Chesterton wrote a letter in with just 2 words, I am. What's wrong with the world? I am. Sin is. Sin's what's wrong with the world. And what's the solution? The grace of God. One at Calvary. That pays it all. That welcomes the least and the lost to come to him. Near where I live in Bedford is a little village called Oney. And Oney is perhaps famous for being the place where a man called John Newton was the minister. You can go and see the place he lived. You can go and see his church. You can see where he's buried. It's just about probably 8 or 9 miles from where I live. John Newton was born in London in 1725, and one of his biographers described him as a wild and angry young man who rebelled against everybody at every opportunity. When he was 18, he was press-ganged into the Navy, where his rule-breaking earned him a public flogging. At one point, he contemplated murdering the captain and then committing suicide by throwing himself overboard. He said of himself in his own autobiography, I was exceedingly vile. I not only sinned with a high hand myself, but I made it my study to tempt and seduce others. Newton worked on slave ships. He worked for a slave trader. He mistreated others and suffered mistreatment himself. He was a hardened and aggressive atheist. And then one day on one of these ships, one night he picked up a Christian book. And in boredom, he began to read it. And as he read it, he began to worry that its words may actually be true. That same night, the ship was caught in a terrible storm, and Newton found himself crying out to God that he be saved. It's a turning point for Newton's life. After this, he began to think more about his life. He got a Bible. He was beginning to read his Bible and pray and learn what it meant to be a Christian. After he left the ships, he actually became a preacher. He became a minister. He became a hymn writer. He eventually joined William Wilberforce in the campaign to abolish slavery. And in December of 1772, Newton was preparing a New Year's Day message And he was basing it on the words of a prayer of King David, which says this: "Who am I, Lord, and what is my family that you've brought me thus far?" And Newton liked to write hymns for the occasion, so he wrote this New Year's Day hymn. It was going to be sung 1st of January 1773. He wrote this hymn to kind of reinforce the message of his sermon and echo something of his own story. And the first verse of that New Year's Day hymn went like this: "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see." Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we want to praise you for the astonishing and amazing wonder of grace, of that free, undeserved, unmerited, unearnable gift that comes to people like us. When we see you for who you are, we like Isaiah, we say, "Woe is me, woe is me, woe is me." But you are rich in mercy. You're abounding in steadfast love. You sent your Son into the world to save sinners. We stand amazed at Jesus, who he is, what he's done, what he continues to do in us, through us, among us, all that he's prepared for us. Amazing, amazing grace. We praise you, Lord Jesus. Amen.